Hello and welcome to Windows in Time, Persistence, Chinese Labor, and the Southern Oregon Railroads, presented by Jackson County Library Services and Southern Oregon Historical Society. I am Carrie Tannehill, Jackson County Library Services, Adult Services Librarian. For more information about Windows in Time, you can visit our website, jcls.org. And we do have a 2020 schedule of Windows in Time programs, and it has a printable schedule. So before Larry gets started, just want to say the views and opinions expressed in this program are those of the presenter and do not necessarily reflect the official policy or presented position of Jackson County Library Services. Today's printer is Larry. He is a retired educator and has written extensively on Western Railroad topics. He is a co-author of the Southern Pacific and Los Angeles 1873-1996 book. Larry, thank you for being with us today and sharing this information. I will give it over to you.
Well, you're welcome. Let me just say a few comments. In a sense, we know very little about the Chinese who built the railroads. They left almost no written records. We have, on the other hand, a lot written about them from various places all over the West. So when you get to Southern Oregon, the challenge is the same problem. There's very little written about them, yet we know so much by observing their lifestyle, understanding their roots and their aspirations. So all of that plays a part in today's presentation. I want to thank in a particular way the researchers at Stanford's North American Railroad Project, who have collated some really remarkable items, many of them from China that have never before been published. And this all occurred in the last 5 years or so. And also the Southern Oregon Laboratory of Anthropology and Chelsea Rose have been doing some great work with Chinese excavation here and at one of the tunnels in the Siskiyous. Finally, I need to say that although many of the photographs that we see that suggest the story are taken from the internet and are public domain pictures, many others, and particularly those showing actual scenes in the railroad construction in Southern Oregon, are from the Southern Oregon Historical Society, which has a truly remarkable collection of railroad pictures. It also has some really fine researchers who are always happy to share their insights, their critiques, and their corrections. So with that, let's get started. Persistence, Chinese labor, and the Southern Oregon Railroads. The story of Chinese railroad labor in Southern Oregon occurs at the end of a very long journey. It begins in China's south province of Guangdong, at a point where the Pearl River flows into the South China Sea and forms a fertile agricultural delta. The country swarms with overpopulation, a British traveler of the late 1870s wrote, and a large number of inhabitants were either chronically unemployed or extremely land-poor peasants. Many of these were common laborers, attached to groups or gangs drawn from the same family or clan. Within these labor gangs, under an elected headman, the workers spoke the same dialects, worshiped the same gods, and ate the same food. When needed, hundreds of such gangs could be gathered for large projects, such as irrigation canals, river dikes, or excavating reservoirs. Otherwise, they found work where they could get it. The life of a common laborer involved working 11-hour days, 7 days a week, for which they earned as little as 5 to 15 cents a day. The labor gangs were close-knit. An observer wrote, "The father carries the son. The elder brothers take the young brother along." And such gangs were highly desirable for their cheapness and steadiness. In the first part of the 1800s, such labor was often exported to the Malay Peninsula, Indonesia, India, Thailand, South America, and the Caribbean. But by mid-century, no destination was held in higher esteem or more sought after than Gold Mountain, the fabled land of California. Here it was said a worker could earn 5 times as much as he could in China, and that within a year or two, he could return home a wealthy man. I'm stuck again. Between 1865 and 1869, an estimated 10,000 Chinese laborers were contracted for American railroad construction. Virtually all of them shipped out of the British Crown colony of Hong Kong, where, under the watchful eyes of Chinese labor brokers, the gangs, mostly from Guangdong province, were gathered, outfitted, and placed aboard San Francisco-bound steamships. The workers chosen were usually young, desperate for work, highly motivated, and enormously hopeful. Virtually all of them came from rural communities. Records of a voyage of a Pacific Mail steamship in 1875 show 800 Chinese passengers aboard. They came from 110 different villages, and 80% of these came in large groups from the same village, and they bore the same name. Such laborers were a distinctive class. A French traveler crossing the Pacific in the late 1860s on a ship with 400 or 500 Chinese passengers wrote, "A portion of them were there to engage in small trades such as tailor, cobbler, or laundryman. But most had signed up in advance for railroad work." When the Chinese disembarked from their ships at San Francisco, it was the arrival of the gang laborers who caught the attention of Americans. In 1869, a reporter from the Atlantic Monthly described, quote, "a living stream of the blue-coated men of Asia, bearing long bamboo poles across their shoulders from which hung packages of bedding, matting, and clothing, pours down the plank. They appear to be of an average age of 25 years, and though somewhat less in stature than Caucasians, are healthy, active, and able-bodied to a man. All dressed in coarse but clean and new blue cotton blouses and loose baggy breeches. And most of them carry 1 or 2 broad-brimmed hats of split bamboo. As they come down upon the wharf, they separate into gangs of 10, 20, or 30 each. Each group stands silently, waiting in patience and perfectly soldier-like order. For 2 mortal hours, the blue stream pours down from the steamship upon the wharf, and still they come. Almost all of these workers were enrolled in one of the Chinese cooperative associations, known collectively as the Big Six companies, headquartered in the city, that now fed, housed, and soon dispatched them to a railroad project. The newcomers were innately curious, but they were raised to see China as the center of the universe, that it revolved around their emperor, their ancestors, and religious feasts. They had never seen a locomotive or even a pocket watch, but none of this compared with what they now experienced. Even Americans found their first encounter with railroad construction awe-inspiring. Arriving at the railroad camp early in the morning, our journalists reported seeing long lines of horses, mules, and wagons standing in the open near the camp train. 4 men are galloping here and there on horseback, giving or receiving orders. Swarms of laborers, Chinese, Europeans and Americans hurrying to their work. To the eastward stretched the grade, marked by a line of newly disturbed earth. By the side of the grade smokes the campfires of the blue-clad laborers who could be seen in groups, waiting for the signal to start work. Everything moved with bustle and energy amidst the sounds of steam whistles, clanging metal, and shouting voices. At the railhead, most new workers were bundled onto wagons and transported to small camps located miles ahead in the wilderness, one of the many advanced bases spread along the projected route of the road. These camps too left memories. What we see startled us, a Chinese folk singer explained. For houses, we saw just tents. For pillows, we saw stone, and for beds, hay. Attached to every gang was a Chinese bookman with an abacus, who kept a precise account of the debts owed to the workers. The cost of their ocean voyage was amortized over time. Small deductions were paid to their headman, to their cook, to letter writers, and above all, to their membership in one of the big 6 companies, the benevolent societies that gave them access to medical care in the person of an herbalist, legal services, and the guarantee that if they died, their remains would be shipped back to China for proper burial. Work patterns were different from what they had known in China. Each day began at dawn with the sound of a bugle or the clanging of a bell. Workers were divided by rank and function. Whites laid track, served as wagon drivers, built bridges and trestles, and operated heavy drilling equipment. In China, earth was moved exclusively with wheelbarrows. Here, the workers were equipped with horses and carts attached to their 40-man crews. Their primary task was to move earth. They prepared the roadbed by building embankments, cutting through ridges, and filling depressions. More specialized labor gangs of Chinese bolted rails, finished spiking, and leveled the tracks. Many became expert in the use of explosives and did tunnel and rock work. Construction employees were dependent upon one another. White engineers and surveyors constantly moved among the Chinese laborers, checking the elevations and center points of the track. White foremen managed their gangs with a firm hand and measured daily progress by the cubic yards of earth moved, the amount of trackage put down each day. None of this was idyllic. The practice of driving the pick and shovel man, a railroader explained, became an obsession with gang leaders. Woe betide the worker whose shovel did not carry a full load. Higher officers could be particularly intimidating. Charles Crocker, who eventually became president of the Southern Pacific Railroad, recalled riding along the line of workers, bellowing at them to hurry the work. The Chinese particularly feared Southern Pacific Superintendent J.H. Strobridge, a white worker recalled. They feared him as much as they did the Chinese devil. He had a mild but firm way in the form of a pick handle, and he would bring his persuader into action and was not particular where it landed. Inside of 5 minutes, you did not find a Chinese in camp and could hear them say, "Makahai," hail chief, as they went to their work. Most abuse, however, was verbal. There is a time to swear, one American foreman explained. Men can't work without it. It is the battery that fires up their nerves and makes them energetic. And for the Chinese, such treatment, in fact, was mild compared with what they had experienced in their home country. And over time, Americans and Chinese learned to get along. When we started employing Chinese, Charles Crocker explained, white men would not work within 100 rods of them. But now they work together, and one man will take hold of a piece of iron on one side and the Chinese worker on the other. Chinese became trusted assistants. This photograph, taken of an engineering group near Roseburg in the early 1880s, is typical. The wagon driver is Chinese, and other Chinese and Americans are mingled together. In track maintenance work, white foremen and Chinese also work closely together. But in relations with labor gang headmen, attention had always to be paid by the company to cultural differences. No Chinaman would work without a contract, Crocker explained. It would take days to negotiate a contract, but once it was signed, there could be no deviations. Food from Hong Kong in the form of dried oysters, fish, rice crackers, bamboo sprouts, and dried seaweed, not to mention rice and tea, had to arrive on time and in proper quantity. Water had to be supplied for their daily sponge baths. Chinese holidays had to be respected. Above all, the New Year celebration, a several-day period in which the Chinese workers would put on their best clothes, eat, play music, and reverence their gods and ancestors. Although Chinese received 20% less than their white counterparts, they insisted that their salary be commensurate with that offered to Chinese on other railroads. Unfavorable differences could lead to a Chinese work suspensions. Strikes with the Chinese were ritualistic in nature. They could occur without warning across 100 miles of construction work, and it was never learned how Chinese could communicate and coordinate such things with each other. In such a strike, unlike American workers, the Chinese would remain peacefully in their camps. It was like Sunday, once a French journalist noted. The railroad would respond by cutting off their food supplies, suspending pay, and levying charges for horse and mules not in service. Eventually, Chinese labor brokers would be called in. Face-saving concessions would be made, and work would resume. It was not a perfect system, but it functioned. Despite many inequities, the railroad made an effort to maintain good labor relations. We have treated them like men, Crocker testified to a congressional committee, and they have treated us like men, and they are good and true. Few Americans ever saw Chinese labor gangs in action, but those that did were impressed. A commentator wrote, "The work swarmed with celestials, shoveling, wheeling, carting, drilling, and blasting rocks and earth, while their dull, moony eyes, their faces as unreadable as marble, stared out from under those immense basket hats." Another recorded that, quote, "when the supply train arrived, ties, hay, etc., were taken off the cars onto wagons in an incredibly short time. The superintendent and his aides were on the ground, but did not seem needed at all, as each man knew his part and did it with a will. Order and system ruled." The labor gangs served without fanfare. Only once was the workforce shown off to newspaper editors and politicians. And this occurred in a remote desert canyon northeast of Los Angeles as part of a final spike ceremony, joining tracks from Northern and Southern California. A reporter recorded, "On emerging from the cars, we were met with one of the most picturesque sights imaginable. There were nearly 4,000 people on the ground, nearly 3,000 being Chinese employees of the road, who with their picks, shovels, and bamboo hats were seen drawn up in battle array. Swarms of Chinamen and scores of teams and drivers formed a working display such as is seldom seen. When the spike was patted into place connecting Northern and Southern California, the Chinese cheered along with their white comrades. Such was the workaday world of the Chinese that built the Western railroads and that built Southern Oregon's railroads. But for all of these, there is a darker side to our tale. Before leaving their home country, Chinese workers had been told that they would be welcome in America. Quote, "Pay is excellent. Housing, food, and clothing are abundant and first rate," a recruiting ad stated. "You need not feel fear." But America was not what it had been made out to be. During the 1870s and 1880s, anti-Chinese sentiment was common in the towns and cities of the Pacific West. There were circumstances that fed such hysteria. The constant flow of Chinese seemed like an alien invasion. And it was said that white labor could not compete against them. They worked too hard, they charged too little. Others complained that they were devious, untrustworthy. The shape of their eyes, the hue of their skin, a British visitor wrote, are regarded as disabilities unfitting them for being treated as rational human beings. Abuse in San Francisco was commonplace. "Chinese are insulted," a railroad leader complained, "and you see it done in every place you go." A strong police escort was needed at times to accompany new arrivals to San Francisco from the landing wharf to Chinatown. They were mercilessly attacked by cartoonists in the press, portrayed as locusts, rooting pigs, murderers and rapists, godless heathens, opium fiends, and bearers of pestilence. To a greater or lesser degree, such sentiments were widespread throughout the far West and Oregon during the 1870s and 80s. In 1883, a reference in the Jacksonville, Oregon Sentinel referred to Chinese as, quote, "yellow animals." Such sentiments, perhaps in milder form, were shared even by progressive leaders such as Portland suffragette Abigail Scott Dunway. "Everything about them was wrong," she wrote. "Their manner, habits, socialism, and government are diametrically opposite to ours." Oregon U.S. Representative Melvin C. George was far more blunt. "Chinese," he told the U.S. Congress, "are cheap, servile, ignorant labor. They are the most debased people on the face of the earth." In their place, he pleaded for, quote, "people of our race, the English, Irish, Scots, German, or Scandinavians." By the 1880s, getting rid of the Chinese was seen by many as the solution to all that ailed society, and a drumbeat of voices was heard across the land. The Chinese, no, no, no. The Chinese must go. In smaller towns, Chinese were burnt out of their homes. They were banned from certain counties. At huge torchlit rallies in San Francisco, working men sang in unison, "Save us from the slavery of Asia and its filth and crime." Such intense feelings resulted in a new California Constitution, enacted in 1879, that prohibited all corporations in the state from employing, quote, "any Chinese or Mongolian." The article was quickly struck down in federal court. But Californians then turned to Congress and in 1882 obtained the passage of the Chinese Exclusion Act, forbidding entry to the country of all Chinese labor. From the perspective of the large Western railroads, the prohibition against Chinese labor could not have happened at a worse time. When the 1882 Exclusion Act went into effect, construction projects in Eastern Oregon and Washington Territory were employing thousands of Chinese, and the railroads were clamoring for more. Among those particularly in need were the Oregon and Transcontinental Railroad and the Central Pacific Railroad companies, both of which had ambitious plans to extend their lines south, the other north, to a junction point on the California-Oregon border. At the behest of these railroads, Hong Kong brokers in the single month of January 1882 shipped an estimated 25,000 laborers to the United States before the law went into effect. Vessels were dispatched from Hong Kong directly to Portland for the first time. Other Chinese workers were transported by coastal vessels to Portland from San Francisco. Still, it was not enough to meet the needs of the Northwest. Chinese labor brokers began to search Portland and Oregon towns and mining camps for additional labor. By mid-May, the Oregon and Transcontinental somehow had managed to assemble a workforce of over 3,000 men and had entered the rugged Cow Creek Canyon region south of Roseburg. Here, along a 36-mile stretch of track, Chinese were put to work carving out a roadbed and boring 5 separate tunnels. Working from campsites accessible only by wagon on crudely built roads, the railroad took almost 9 months to bring its tracks to Glendale, 65 miles south of Roseburg. By this time, work was already well advanced on a large tunnel through the Cow Creek Mountains leading to Wolf Creek, and another under Mount Sexton leading into the Rogue Valley. And high in the Siskiyou Mountains above Ashton, 2 additional projects were underway. A 3,100-foot summit tunnel and a 1,750-foot Buck Rock tunnel. These 2 were also commenced. And Chinese and white crews were working around the clock, 3 shifts a day. By the summer of 1883, with track laying still months away in Southern Oregon, wagons were hauling in prodigious quantities of heavy timber for bridge and trestle work. Meanwhile, on the southern front, 120 miles below the Oregon border at Redding, work on the Central Pacific had gotten underway in April of 1873. Its goal was to meet the Oregon-California Railroad at the California border. To provide the needed workers, the Central Pacific's affiliate line, the Southern Pacific, sent north some 2,000 Chinese laborers who had just completed a line in the Mojave Desert. To discourage desertions, conductors were ordered not to stop their trains in larger towns or cities. During this same period, Chinese labor contractors scoured the towns and mining camps of Northern California looking for more Chinese workers, I thought we would have no trouble getting men, Charles Crocker wrote on June 8, 1883. I find we have 3,500 men on the work, and it is about all we can get. Soon after track laying began north from Redding in Sacramento Canyon, the entire Chinese labor force went on strike, demanding a 25% increase in pay and a 10% decrease in hours. The railroad replied by cutting off food and suspending pay. We will fight this all the way, Charles Crocker declared from railroad headquarters in San Francisco, and we have got the Chinese pretty well starved out. Eventually, an accommodation was reached for a higher pay rate, but it would not go into effect until the following spring, almost a year away. Work resumed. The route twisted and turned up the precipitous Sacramento River Canyon and was twice the length of the line through Cow Creek, and both had been built in hitherto impassable territory. Quote, rougher and more of it is all I can say, an old railroader explained. Our gangs say it's the hardest piece of road they have ever worked upon. Tons of explosives were required for the Chinese to cut a shelf along the river's edge for the tracks. Chinese were digging deep holes and setting powder charges every 50 feet. While the Central Pacific of California Company pressed ahead, the mother company of the Oregon railroads was not faring well. Overextended and verging on bankruptcy, the Oregon and Transcontinental Company had been quietly laying off Chinese since November. When a 20% cut in wages was announced in January for all laborers, Chinese working on the Siskiyou tunnels immediately struck, and their food supplies were cut off, but it hardly mattered. The decision had already been made higher up to abandon the route over the mountains and lay track only as far as the foothill town of Ashland. Within a few weeks, all work on the two tunnels ceased. Tunnel workers were laid off, leaving behind them only large gaping holes in the mountainsides. Meanwhile, however, construction for the Oregon and Transcontinental Railroad Company continued in the valleys below. Led by an advance force of Chinese graders numbering some 15,000 men, track layers opened the roads to Grants Pass in December 1883. And by the end of February 1884, had laid tracks as far as Phoenix. Excitement ran wild as farmers and town dwellers celebrated the coming of the cars. The town of Ashland was reached in May. But during this same period, large crowds of recently dismissed Chinese laborers passed through the valley on their way to get work in California, where the Central Pacific was still building up its force for the spring push northward. In San Francisco, it was reported that all the wagon makers in the city were building Chinese dump carts, and that the railroad was acquiring horses wherever they could be found. It was also said that the Central Pacific was hiring Chinese labor gangs for $26 to $30 a head per month per worker. But then in mid-April, the Central Pacific also suspended work on the line, abruptly cutting some 5,000 Chinese and 1,500 white workers from its labor rolls. The suspension of work was attributed to the railroad's unfavorable treatment by the California legislature. But for the laborers, it made no difference. The sudden loss of employment was devastating. It was particularly hard on the Chinese, who were let go during a period of extreme anti-Chinese violence. Without the protection of the railroad, they had few safe places to go. Some stayed in Portland or San Francisco. Others returned to China. Within a few years, it was reported that the Chinese population of California had declined 37%. But during the period in which all hope seemed gone for a line over the Siskiyous, the Central Pacific succeeded in obtaining a controlling interest in the Oregon and Transcontinental. More specifically, a subsidiary known as the Oregon and California. After a 16-month hiatus, it announced that construction would resume. And like a sleeping dragon, the Central Pacific's construction army awoke from slumber and gathered its strength for one last dramatic push. Building over the Siskiyous was something Central Pacific Chief Engineer William Hood anticipated would, quote, compare with the most expensive railroads ever constructed, and require the handling of as large a force as can be worked. In all, some 4,500 Chinese were gathered, many of them longtime Central and Southern Pacific veterans. By the end of 1886, track layers of the Central Pacific were finally out of the Sacramento Canyon. Another 5 months were needed to complete the next 70 miles of track to the base of the Siskiyous. On January 1st, on June 1st, 1887, passenger trains were running to Cole Stage Stop on the California-Oregon border north of Wairika. Meanwhile, in the high mountains, a large number of Chinese were already at work completing the 3,100-foot summit tunnel. And in the process, millions of cubic yards of rock and earth were once again being moved by explosives, shovel and carts, and railroad flat cars in larger quantities and in faster time than the Far West had seen in a decade. Most of the route over the Siskiyous required cutting into the steep mountain sides as the tracks spiraled and doubled back on themselves several times. Not until October of that year did the first work train pass through the long summit tunnel. And heavy beams were brought up from California and then lowered by Chinese down the precipitous slopes that were assembled into towering structures. This great curving trestle in the Siskiyous was 150 feet high. This bridge measured 170 feet from the ground to the top of the rails. Although the Chinese presence was much in evidence, photographs taken of the Siskiyou work largely ignored them. In this shot, white Chinamen are posed with the Chinese white enginemen are posed with a Chinese worker barely visible with his bamboo hat behind them. Here we see a picture of a massive trestle approach with work on a large cut by Chinese just barely visible in the background. An exception occurred in this rare action shot of Chinese gang laborers, hundreds of workers hacking through a hillside, one terrace at a time in unison. For the most part, however, it is only incidental when Chinese are shown. In this picture, taken in the Siskiyous, the photographer concentrates on the locomotive. But a closer look reveals Chinese laborers with basket hats sitting atop earth piled on flat cars. In part, the railroad itself contributed to these attitudes. Lists of laborers never give individual names, but only those of the headman for which the worker was employed and the number of workers he managed. Chinese workers killed in construction accidents were always referred to as Chinamen. The names are never given. The Southern Oregon press also kept quiet about their presence. When a construction camp containing 1,000 Chinese workers was located near Ashland, the Jacksonville Sentinel referred to them only as graders, a euphemism constantly used for Chinese, while it praised the good work of their white Irish foremen. Such men as Morgan, Morris, Sullivan, and Fogarty. But it took 7 months for the persistent Chinese, who as usual were doing the bulk of the labor, to complete the tunnels and prepare the roadbed for the route over the Siskiyous. By the final month of 1887, the work was substantially completed. But when the train from the south carrying dignitaries to the Golden Spike ceremony at Ashland paused at the type of the Siskiyous on December 17th, most of the Chinese were already gone. The only sign that they had ever been there were their horse carts neatly stacked in the snow. The completion of the railroad between Ashland and California was the last hurrah of large Chinese workforces in the far west. With railroads under assault in the national and state legislatures, and the number of available labor gangs decreasing, it was no longer expedient to employ Chinese construction gangs. Small numbers of Chinese found construction employment in California's Salinas Valley and elsewhere. And for a few years, the railroad continued to hire Chinese for track maintenance and house them in small quarters in out-of-the-way places. But by the mid-1890s, Chinese workers, apart from occasional seasonal work, had been replaced on the far west coast by other minorities, Filipinos, Mexicans, Blacks, even Japanese. The heyday of mass Chinese labor forces had ended. Some Chinese remained in America. Many returned to China or migrated to Canada or Mexico. From beginning to end, the common laborers had been largely a faceless, nameless presence, yet they constituted more than 80% of the railroad construction workers. There would be no memoirs written, collections of letters discovered, or great novels published about them. Their leave-taking was as silent as their coming. Whatever records may have existed about them with their names and origins, held by the Chinese 6 companies, were destroyed by the 1906 San Francisco fire. But they had left their mark. Across a period of 30 years, and constructed over 6,000 miles of track for 20 Western railroads, a total that exceeded the amount of new railroad construction in any other country in the world. The results of their handiwork are still visible to us. Their great cuts, fills, and footings can be seen wherever mainline tracks are found. Humble but seemingly indelible monuments to the Chinese laborers, once described by a 19th century commentator as, quote, the most patient, ready, apt, and industrious toilers on the face of the earth. Thank you.